My name is Dre Breezy, and you are now listening to The Breeze. Today's podcast, we're going to be focusing on the incredible, the legendary Marsha P. Johnson. Marsha P. Johnson was a radical transgendered activist and feminist that spearheaded the Stonewall uprising in New York City in the 60s. But before we get started talking about Marsha P. Johnson, I just want to say some of y'all had little slick comments about my rapping in last week's podcast. And I'll just throw it out there. I'm not a rapper. I'm not a recording artist. That's not even, I think, even in the cards for me ever in life. But I do think it's important for me to express, my creativity and what I feel. And I feel like the best way to do that is through spoken word. And for the record, some of y'all's favorite rappers ain't rappers either. You don't want the smoke. Now let's get back to our regularly scheduled paid programming. Malcolm Michaels Jr., August 24th, 1945, in Elizabeth City, New Jersey. Marsha P. Johnson was the fifth out of 7 children. Her father worked at an assembly line and her mother was a housekeeper. According to the New York Times, Marsha P. Johnson graduated from Thomas Edison High School in 1963 and immediately moved to New York City with $15 and a bag of clothes. Honestly, nowadays, that would be looked at as rather cliche, but back in the day, that was more like a gay rite of passage. Honestly, New York City was very difficult for Marsha P. Johnson. She had already begun to transition, or probably already completely transitioned to Marshall by the time she was living in the streets. And it was very difficult for queer people. It was very difficult for gay people, most especially very difficult for transgendered people to exist freely and happily anywhere in the country, but most definitely in New York City. Just to give a little context about New York City during the time, it was definitely not easy to live outside of kind of heteronormative standards. New York State did downgrade sodomy from a felony to a misdemeanor in 1950, but persecution of gay people and criminalization of their activities were still common. Same-sex dancing in public was prohibited. The state liquor authority banned bars from serving gay people alcoholic beverages, and people could be charged with sexual deviancy for cross-dressing. So all of these things made it very difficult for people like Marsha P. Johnson to survive. And so she had to resort to escorting and, selling her body for sexual services. It wasn't until 1969 that everything changed. On June 28th, 1969, the police scheduled a regular raid on the Stonewall Inn. The Stonewall Inn was a gay bar that was primarily used by gay men. The police scheduled regular raids on gay bars because they were gay bars frequented by gay men. And the police felt that these people were deviants and were abominations, and they deserved to be punished. On this specific day, the people at the Stonewall, including Marsha P. Johnson, had decided they had enough. They resisted arrest. They began to fight back. And in the early morning of June 28th, 1969, a movement was formed. Here is a 1970 interview with Marsha describing the riots.
But everyone agrees that Marsha was there, so...
The way I winded up being at Stonewall that night, I was having a party uptown, and we were all out there, and Miss Sylvia and Rivera and them were over in the park having a cocktail. I was uptown, and I didn't get downtown until about 2 o'clock, because when I got downtown, the place was already on fire, and it was a raid already. The riots had already started, and they said the police went in there and set the place on fire. They said the police set it on fire because they originally wanted the Stonewall to close, so they had several raids.
Were you one of those that got in the chorus lines and kicked their heels up at the police? Like Ziegfeld Folly Girls or Rockettes?
Oh, no. We were too busy throwing over cars and screaming in the middle of the street because we were so upset because they closed that place.
What were you screaming in the street?
Huh?
What did you say to the police?
We just were saying no more police brutality, and we had enough of police harassment in the village and other places. Oh, there was a lot of little chants we used to do in those days.
The Stonewall riots lasted for 2 days and attracted thousands of New Yorkers from all over the city to either join in on the protests or just watch. The Stonewall uprising was the first instance of gay people fighting back against an oppressive force. It was the start of the gay rights movement. The Stonewall uprising has been compared to many to Rosa Parks' resistance in not standing or refusing to sit in the back of the bus. It really was that important. Marsha P. Johnson was young when this happened. She was only 23, yet she shot to fame and stardom because she was such a visible and vocal presence in that resistance. She used her newfound fame to enhance her activism and enhance her scope, becoming involved with some of the first gay pride parades and lots of community organizing. And when I say community organizing in terms of Marsha P. Johnson, this is a person that for a lot of the kids that were on the street, she's looked at as a mother. New York City during this time had a lot of people that were queer that were thrown out of their homes, that were disowned by their families, and had to live on the street. And people like Marsha would come up and help them and guide them and teach them how to survive. There weren't very many people that could do that. And she filled a very special role in that regard. I couldn't talk about Marsha P. Johnson without bringing up another revolutionary figure during this time, which is Sylvia Rivera. Sylvia Rivera was one of those children that Marsha found on the street. She was born in the Bronx and is of Venezuelan and Puerto Rican descent. And unfortunately, her parents were not accepting of her identity as a transgender woman, so they kicked her out on the street at about 11. She had to resort to being a child prostitute to make her way through life until about 14 when she ran into Marsha P. Johnson. It seems that Marsha was the one that gave Sylvia her first glimpse into political activism, and it was kind of like a fuse that had been lit that you really couldn't put that out. After the Stonewall riots of 1969, both Marsha and Sylvia became very, very involved with the gay rights movement. And they quickly realized that there was a huge issue in the gay rights movement, which was their refusal to look at transgendered people as part of this movement. Initially, Marsha and Sylvia were both part of the Gay Activist Alliance, which was formed in direct response to the Stonewall riots. But very quickly, they started their own group which focused on transgendered people, which was called STAR. STAR stands for Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, and their goal was to provide safety and shelter for queer homeless youth. STAR is credited with being one of the first transgendered assistance programs in the country. Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera should get full credit for this. They received a lot of pushback from the gay community, and they received a lot of pushback from New York City for renting out this building. The building itself was on 213 2nd Avenue in East Village, and a lot of times they put their locations near Greenwich and near East Village because that's where a lot of the queer homeless people were located. In a 1970 interview with Voices of Gay Liberation, Marsha talks about her experience in the Gay Activist Alliance. She says, "We still feel oppression by other gay brothers. Gay sisters don't think too bad of transvestites. Gay brothers do. I went to a dance at the Gay Activist Alliance just last week, and there was not even one gay brother that came over and said hello. They say hello, but they get away very quick. The only transvestites that were there were very friendly, but they look freaky in drag, like freak drag with no tits, no nothing. Well, I can't help but have tits, they're mine. And those men weren't too friendly at all. Once in a while, I get an invitation to Daughters of Bilitis, and when I go there, they're always warm. All the gay sisters come over and say, 'Hello, we're glad to see you,' and they start long conversations." Now, I don't know what the hell Daughters of Bilitis is, but I do know the issue that Marsha is talking about is an issue that still exists today, and it's a lack of intersectionality amongst marginalized groups. And I'm going to talk about this later in the podcast. One of the most prominent displays of the lack of intersectionality was in 1973 when Sylvia Rivera was pining to speak at the Gay Pride event in Washington Square in New York City. She was met with lots and lots of boos, and there generally was a hostile energy and a hostile response to her presence there. Here's a clip of her speech.
Hi, lady. I have been to jail. I have been raped and beaten many times by men, heterosexual men that do not belong in the homosexual shelter. But do you do anything for them? No. You all tell me to go and hide my tail between my legs. I will not longer put up with this shit. I have been beaten. I have had my nose broken. I have been thrown in jail. I have lost my job. I have lost my apartment for gay liberation. And you all treat me this way? What the fuck's wrong with you all? Think about that. I do not believe in a revolution, but you all do. I believe in the gay power. I believe in us getting our rights, or else I would not be out there fighting for our rights. That's all I wanted to say to your people. If you all want to know about the people that are in jail, and do not forget Bambi Lamore and Dora Marks, Kenny Messner, and other gay people that are in jail, come and see the people at Starhouse on 12th Street, on 640 East 12th Street, between B and C, apartment 14. The people that are trying to do something for all of us, and not men and women that belong to a white middle class, white club. And that's what you all belong to. Revolution now!
So it's about 1974, and Marsha is at what many would say is the peak of her career or peak of her fame. She is living in New York City, and she actually catches the attention of a rather popular artist of the time. His name was Andy Warhol. And if, for those of you who don't know, Andy Warhol was a pop artist, which meant he captured a lot of images of either familiar visuals that we see often. Many of us are familiar with the Campbell Soup cam, but he also did portraits of some of his famous celebrities or some of his famous friends who happen to be celebrities. And he also paid special attention to some of the more prominent activist voices that were in New York City at the time. Marsha P. Johnson was probably the biggest activist voice at the time, so it was only inevitable that Andy Warhol would have called her in 1974 and invited her to his place in Union Square, the factory, and there he produced his legendary Ladies and Gentlemen portraits. Through all of this going on in Marsha Johnson's life, she actually spent most of this time being homeless. She also says that she had been arrested over 100 times, and she didn't have an official number because once she passed 100, she stopped counting. She never really had an official home that she stayed at throughout her career as an activist. There are plenty of stories that I found online of people in the flower district that would find her sleeping under the flower booths. She was definitely known for her flamboyant, colorful outfits, and a lot of times in pictures you'll see that she has flowers draped around either her head or her neck in very elaborate designs. And I'm assuming that's from sleeping where a bunch of people are selling flowers. In 1980, Marsha P. Johnson was offered a permanent place to live with an old friend of hers, Randy Wicker. Now, when we start talking about Randy Wicker is when things get a little bit more complicated. Randy Wicker is also an activist. During this time, Randy Wicker put a lot of his energy and time into reclaiming a lot of the events and establishments that were frequented by gay people but were not owned by gay people. So he, during this time, was very influential in regaining control of the Christopher Street Festival, which in a lot of ways was the first gay pride festival. So here's the thing. A lot of these places, including the Stonewall, during this time were owned by the mob. And as we all know, the mob's not the most progressive establishment, not the most progressive organization. So a lot of times what they would do is they would take money from these gay events and these gay bars, and then they would spend them on whatever criminal stuff the mafia was doing at the time. And therefore the gay people that needed this money and these resources the most weren't able to see that. Randy Wickers obviously thought this was wrong and unfair, so he put a lot of energy into essentially fighting the mob and taking control over what the mob had. This caused a lot of conflict between him and Marsha. Marsha didn't fear a lot, but she seemed to have a lot of fear of the mob. This conflict seemed to escalate and escalate up until June 1992. On July 6, 1992, Marsha P. Johnson's body was found in the Hudson River. She was 46 years old. The police ruled her death a suicide and failed to investigate. Marsha's friends and family suspected foul play. The New York City 6th Precinct Police Department refused to open the case. So Marsha's friends and family took it upon themselves to conduct their own investigation. The Life and Death of Marsha P. Johnson on Netflix chronicles that investigation. Released in 2017, it is a documentary that follows Victoria Cruz, a friend of Marsha P. Johnson, on her quest for justice in this unsolved murder. Now, I won't talk too much about this movie because, we all have Netflix and I want you guys to actually watch it. But it really is an indictment of the criminal justice system. Throughout Victoria's journey, she really does encounter, every obstacle to finding out the truth of what happened to her friend. It first starts off with her basically talking to the coroner and being like, what do I need to do to get the autopsy report? And she goes, well, you need to get a written letter from the family. So Victoria gets a written letter from the family, sends it in, and they call her and they're like, actually, we don't have anything on file. So it just all disappeared. I don't know what happened to it. And that's one of so many examples of how it's clearly a system set up to suppress information and suppress justice. Another example of Victoria's, and I was so frustrated for this woman because she's just trying to do the right thing, and people are treating her as if she's trying to do the wrong thing. Another example is she calls the detective that was on the case for Marsha in this film. She calls him, and he's retired. And he picks up. It takes her a while to get to him because it's hard to contact, I guess, retired NYPD officials. So she finally gets into contact with him. And she basically says, she explains her situation. I'm trying to find justice for my friend. And she's just like, is there any way I can meet with you so you can just tell me any kind of information, anything you can remember about this case? And almost before she can get the sentence out, this guy just says no. He refuses every single offer she presents to him. He just absolutely refuses. And then on top of refusing, he says to her that she should leave. He kind of mansplains it to her. He's like, you should leave this up to the professionals. Like, leave this, like, you're in over your head. Leave this for the professionals. And it's completely escaping him that the only reason that she's doing this in the first place is because the professionals such as him are not doing their job. It just boggled my mind that he could say leave it up to the professionals when this woman is 25 years after her friend's death trying to investigate because the public officials that we pay our tax dollars to serve and protect, refuse to do their job. So once again, throughout this film, this woman is, she's pretty much a saint because everywhere she goes, every time she goes to the state to get help in solving this murder, they basically tell her, fuck off. As I mentioned earlier, the lack of intersectionality among oppressed groups is really what a lot of these films and a lot of the messages and statements that Sylvia and Marsha were making were criticizing that lack of intersectionality. A lot of their criticisms were that the gay movement, in many ways, is just the gay white middle class movement, and everyone outside of those demographics aren't really getting swept up or caught up in that wave of progress. To give a quick example, here is a clip of Randy Wicker and his comments and thoughts about Star.
Transvestite Action Revolutionaries with Miss Sylvia Rivera.
Star.
What was that group about? What was it for?
It was a group for transvestites.
It was a bunch
Men
of
and women transvestites.
it was a bunch of flaky, fucked up transvestites
But-
living in a hovel in a slum somewhere, calling themselves revolutionaries.
The problem with this lack of intersectionality is that it is literally killing trans people. I'm just going to drop a couple statistics on you that I got from Vice News. Since 2014, at least 110 trans women were killed. Only 42% of the investigations resulted in an arrest, compared to about 61% of murder cases across the general public. 88 of the murder victims were Black. Another 11 were identified as Latinx. As of today, in this country, in 2020, 26 transgendered women of color have been killed. In 2019, 21 were murdered, and all of them were women of color. We talk about the coronavirus pandemic, and we talk about the opioid epidemic, and we talk about the drug war and all of these failed policies. But we as a country have failed to talk about how we failed transgendered women. A lot of the reason why I wanted to do this podcast in the first place was to bring attention to the suffering, the disproportionate suffering that transgendered women of color face. A lot of these women are being murdered just for being transgendered. It's quite upsetting to me, and it should be upsetting to you. The Netflix movie brings up the case of Islan Nettles, who was brutally murdered by James Dixon when she told him she was transgendered. He beat her to death. This is upsetting, yet this is the experience of many transgendered people in this country. Essentially, the reason why this happens is because the court, they allow a defense for people that commit these heinous crimes, and it's called the panic defense. And essentially, the argument is that these men are so panicked by a person being transgendered that they can't help but murder that person. And this is essentially how we allow these people to get slaps on the wrist. James Dixon only got 12 years in prison for murdering someone with his bare hands. Lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, non-binary, asexual people should all be standing up against these injustices. Transgendered women of color have the same right to exist as all of us. And we, as a country, cannot be free until the least of us are free. That is the only way you can judge the success of a country, is how they treat the least of them. As minorities, intersectionality is the only way we can move forward. It can't just be our separate groups where we have the white guys that get their stuff, the Black guys that get their stuff, the women that get their stuff, the indigenous people that get their stuff, the non-binary people that get their stuff. We all have to do this together. We're all in the same ship together. And I think that's what Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia realized, but unfortunately they were far ahead of their time. When it comes to transgendered issues, the truth of the matter is many people just don't care. But that's not the only issue that's affecting transgender people. The fact of the matter is a lot of transgendered women of color, a lot of Black transgendered women don't trust the police. And that doesn't just apply to transgender people. I don't trust the motherfucking police. A lot of Black people don't trust the police because they have not proven themselves trustworthy. So when things happen to transgender people, they feel fearful to go to the police because a lot of times, just like with Stonewall, the police are part of that oppressive force and the police aren't there to help them. In addition to that, a lot of trans people are marginalized from society, so they don't have the same access to resources and opportunity that we have. A lot of them are forced to get into the sex trade. A lot of them are forced to get into drugs because there's no other lifestyle, because we as a society have not made room and space for them. The last thing that affects transgender community most negatively when it comes to getting justice is dead naming. I'll use Marsha as an example. Marsha P. Johnson was born Malcolm, but for the entirety of her life, and to everyone that knew her, she was Marsha, pay it no mind, Johnson. And therefore, when she was murdered and the police conducted an investigation, if they want to find clues on who did it, or if they want to conduct a thorough investigation, they're going to have to use the name that people call her, not the name that she was originally born by. And what we see time and time again across police districts across this country is them using the name, the former name of a transgender person in an investigation. And if you're looking for somebody that goes by Marsha and you're asking for Malcolm, people are going to look at you like you're crazy because you're not asking for the right person. Dead naming is honestly just some weird kind of fucking power flex for people that refuse to accept transgendered people for who they say they are. Dustin Parker, Oklahoma. Alexa Ruiz, Puerto Rico. Yampi Arocho, Puerto Rico. Monica Diamond, Charlotte, North Carolina. Lexi, New York. Johanna Metzger, Baltimore, Maryland. Penelope Ramirez, Puerto Rico. Leila Sanchez, Puerto Rico. Serena Ramos, Puerto Rico. Nina Pop, Missouri. Hel Reagan, Texas. Tony McDade, Florida. Dominique Fells, Philadelphia. Rhea Milton, Ohio. Jane Thompson, Colorado. Selena Hernandez, Chicago. Brayla Stone, Arizona. Mercy Mack, Dallas, Texas. Shaki Peters, Louisiana. Bree Black, Florida. Summer Taylor, Washington. Drea McCarter, Louisiana. Tatiana Hall, Philadelphia. Marilyn Cazares, California. Tiffany Harris, the Bronx, New York. Quaisha Hardy, Louisiana. Brian Powers, Ohio. Asia Roan Spears, Portland, Oregon. Here's a list of all the transgendered women that we know of that have been murdered this year. And it's past time to ask yourself what you're going to do about it. Thank you all so much for listening to my podcast. If you want to learn more about Marsha P. Johnson or Sylvia Rivera, or get in touch with some resources as to how you can help this epidemic affecting transgendered women, go to my website at www.findthebreeze.com. Once again, that's www.findthebreeze.com. Stay tuned for a message from one of our sponsors. Do you suffer from dry, itchy skin on your feet? When you take off your socks, do the bottom of your feet look like a barren desert? When you remove your footwear, do children scream? Have you lost friends due to the condition of your feet? Well, no longer do you have to worry about those shrieks of horror or people mistaking your feet for gargoyle decorations. From the makers of Goya Seasoning comes Immigrants in a Barrel. Immigrants in a Barrel takes all those dirty immigrant children that nobody wants at the border and puts them to good use. Just put your feet inside Immigrants in a Barrel for 10 minutes a day, and in no time your feet will look brand spanking new. We have perfected our secret method of containing the little illegal so they are of no harm to you or our country while gnawing all that yuck off your feet. If you don't see a change in those corns and bunions in 1 week, send them back to us and we'll swap you out for a fresh new batch. Honduran, Nigerian, Guatemalan, Australian, maybe even got a couple Canadians. Just call us now to claim your immigrant in a barrel. So I mentioned in last week's podcast that in this week's podcast, I would discuss a book that I had read. The name of the book is Children of Blood and Bone, and it was written by Tomi Adeyemi, who actually said last week that she was African, and I don't ever know how to describe this. So her parents are Nigerian, and they immigrated here, but she was born in America. So she's a first generation American, or I guess a second generation Nigerian. And this book, as I described last week, is a fantasy book and it has strong, strong African themes. And I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil the book. I do want you all to read it, but I'll give basically a general kind of premise. It's set in this fictional world of Orisha, and there are two different types of people that live in this land. There are the diviners, which are people that can use magic. They are generally pretty much described as a minority. They also look physically different. Everyone in this novel has dark skin. Everyone's, got the chocolate, the vibrancy, the melanin's popping. But the diviners specifically have white hair. The other majority of the population are the Cosidian. The beginning of this novel starts off with King Sauron, who is a Cosidian. These are people that can't use magic. And 11 years prior to the setting of this novel, he has extinguished, he's found a way to stop the diviners from being able to use magic. And simultaneously, he stops them from being able to use magic. And he also goes on pretty much a campaign of terror to oppress and marginalize. And really, for a lot of the diviners, he murders a lot of them. We start off learning that the main protagonist, the main character, her mother was murdered during these campaigns. The main protagonist, her name is Zeely. She is a young adolescent girl, and as you could probably guess, she is a diviner. She comes from a diviner family. I'm not going to tell you which type of family. And the cool thing about the diviners in this book is they all have different abilities. They are all the magical abilities. It's not like Harry Potter where you just have a wand, you can pretty much do everything. Everyone has a certain lane. So there are certain people that can control the elements. There are certain people that can speak in your dreams and speak in your mind. There are certain people that can control the dead. There's certain people that can heal. So there's all different types of magic. I'm not going to tell you what Zeely is. So the story starts off with her basically just trying to survive in this oppressive regime. Expression of magic is explicitly forbidden, and you're still persecuted just for having any kind of traits that associate you with a diviner. She has a brother to Zane who is her protector. He's such a strong character, and throughout the book, he just really keeps her rooted to her family and keeps her rooted to the idea of of certain things, of certain actions just being off limit. She I don't want to tell too much about the story, so I will basically say that the themes of justice and the themes of liberation are very strong with this. I would definitely recommend it to somebody if you want to introduce your child to fantasy or sci-fi. I would definitely recommend this as a great introduction because the themes are. It's not too heavy. It's a good kind of midway point. They don't completely focus on the oppression of the diviners, but it's definitely a strong subplot. Throughout the story, Zeely struggles with a lot of her connection to her heritage. After 11 years of your heritage being demonized in a lot of ways, you internalize that. We see that in our own country. When you demonize a group of people long enough, eventually some of those people start to believe the propaganda. And I'm looking at you, Diamond and Silk, and Ben Carson. And so the story touches on that, touches on how bigotry isn't just contained in the people that are the victims or that are the perpetrators of bigotry. The victims of bigotry can also perpetrate that bigotry as well. But like I said, I don't want to tell you guys too much. I just want to give you a little bit of a synopsis because books are meant to be read. So if you're interested in more information about the book, you can go to my website, findthebreeze.com. I do have a book review that I wrote, and it does have spoilers. Not a lot of spoilers, but just enough to kind of tease you in the right direction. I want to give y'all a little taste of, the cliffhangers and the drops where you're like, what's going to happen next? So yeah, check it out on my website, findthebreeze.com. And once again, the name of the book is Children of Bone and Blood. And the sequel just came out, is Children of Virtue and Vengeance. And I will start reading that actually tonight. So check it out. Take a look at it. Get it on your ebook or your Kindle. I promise you won't be disappointed. I ain't got no money, yeah, my bank account is low. See me in the streets, don't you ask me for some dough. If you see me walking, yeah, I'm walking mighty slow. Take it to another John, cause I'm the face of Poe. I've given up the fight, capitalism take a bite. For this generation, wealth and joy are out of sight. Thank you all so much for tuning into the Breeze podcast. I hope you all enjoyed learning about the legendary Marsha P. Johnson. My name is Dre, and if you want to find any more information about me, my podcast, or any of the things I'm doing, you can go to findthebreeze.com. Stay tuned next week to learn about a transgendered woman who's changing the face of film and television. Her name is Janet Mock.